Hello, friends. My name is Ben Bowler from Unity Earth, and we're here in Peace Week. I'm so delighted to be sitting down with one of the real pioneers over the last few decades of the peace work globally, Steven Dinan of the Shift Network. And Steven, it's an honor to have you here in Peace Week 2022.
Well, thank you, Brother Ben, for carrying the torch of peace building forward with all the work you've been doing.
You know, it's really, really exciting. It's so important, Steven, to, keep these connections going and alive, and also an opportunity to look back at the journey that's brought us to here, the role that you've played, that Shift has played. We're honoring, of course, this year, Phillip Hellmich, beloved to so many in the peace building movement globally, honoring Avon Mattison and her passing as well. And also looking back to some of the critical and key events. When we spoke several months ago about Peace Week, you reminded me that Peace Week was done by the Shift Network back, more than a decade ago. And of course, it goes all the way back to the early 80s and Avon Mattison, Pathways to Peace, and that legacy. So it's truly something which belongs in the commons, and really excited today to talk a little bit about the history, the story, the epic journey that the Shift Network has played and supported in the peace building movement globally. So take us back, Steven. Where did it all start for you? How did you get involved, or how did you get called into peace building yourself?
Well, I think at the deepest level, it was a recognition that we could not have a larger shift on our planet without stopping the level of combativeness that we've had with each other. The roots of violence against other humans are really at the core of what we're outgrowing. It's like if we need to sort of remove those roots at the deepest level, and that's through a flowering of our full potential, our deeper divine nature, where it just doesn't make sense to be doing in any sort of violent relationship with other human beings there, because we are reflections of the same source, that we are all equal in our divinity. And so I don't think you can really fully separate a spiritual path from peace building in the world. And Phillip Hellmich, who you referenced, was a great champion of the phrase of peace building from inner to international. And we've sometimes had a bifurcation where we have the human potential or personal growth movements or spiritual path focusing more on the inner peace building side, and then you've got people who are very technical and accomplished who are focused on these, the negotiation of peace settlements. And it's all really part of a deeper spectrum of our own being, is that there's a prerequisite for global peace to have more enlightened, peaceful individuals, and there's a prerequisite to really create peace building between nations and cultures to have that grounding in personal transformation. And so I think in many ways, when I first received the vision of what I needed to eventually create with the Shift Network, it was back way in 2000, the year 2000. And so it took a long time to even get it off the ground. I had a few attempts. And during those attempts, I think in about 2007 is when I first met Avon Mattison. We actually did a ritual at the site of the signing of the United Nations Charter in San Francisco about peace building with her, that was really invoking this larger vision for peace building. And, she shared her vision of that it's like bridging from an International Day of Peace into a culture of peace. And so out of those conversations grew a recognition. We actually started a nonprofit for a while before Shift was officially founded, called the Summer of Peace. Mm-hmm. And the Summer of Peace was going to the concept was to demonstrate locally in the Bay Area what could a full spectrum engagement of peace building look like. We had some events that were leading up to that. We had a separate executive director. Actually, the current partner, the first partner of California, Jennifer Siebel-Newsom, spoke at an event. We had all kinds of grassroots peace builders. So we were trying to template what would be like a demonstration of peace building locally that's addressing all the sectors of the wheel of co-creation, which Marx Hubbbard was a big champion of, and which also fed into Avon's work, to really approach peace building in a system level and the inner level at the same time. So we realized after founding the Shift Network that it was difficult to try to build the company around personal transformation and have the peace building work separate. So we folded it in. And our first thing in 2011 was to actually, or it might have been 2010 or 2011. I'd have to actually look back, but it's we did a peace week, and so we had really one of the largest offerings that had happened online. We had, I don't know, at least 60 or so sessions over the course of a week. It was sort of an epic journey of peace building, all free. We had 20,000 people sign up, which at that time was really substantial, and and we decided out of that to create a peace ambassador training. I had worked with James O'D on a previous version of Shift called the Shift in Action program in the mid 2000s when he was the president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He was also very committed to peace building work. And so with him, we architected, and Phillip Hellmich came in, as well as Emily Hine, and we basically created a template for training people in a state-of-the-art frontiers of peace building perspective that had spiritual depth and inner transformation, and it looked at all these different facets of conflict transformation. And really, I think it was the state of the art at the time. And we trained eventually over 1,000 peace builders through the Peace Ambassador training. And we had a version of the Summer of Peace that was activated in Oakland, working partnerships at a grassroots level there. It became like a whole wing of Shift that we really dedicated team and time to every year. That the Summer of Peace offerings were some of our most robust offerings, and looking at all these different dimensions of peace. We addressed things like the roots of violence and estrangement with Native peoples by really having a whole Indigenous focus, and we did a declaration of what do we actually call it? It was basically a declaration of support with Indigenous peoples, and our declaration of commitment to Indigenous peoples. And we had 10,000 people sign on to that and presented to the representatives of the 13 Indigenous Grandmothers Council. And so we had all these different facets that we were doing over time. And at the root was really this recognition that the spiritual work of transformation and the system work needed to go hand in hand. It led to some really fascinating events and conversations. Phillip helped bridge us into a peace building conference at the U.S. International Institute of Peace, U.S. Institute of Peace, where there were high-level military people and grassroots peace builders. And some of the military leaders were some of the most sophisticated thinkers about peace that I'd ever met as well. Like, I still remember just how deeply they think about strategy. For instance, sometimes people in our world can get very idealistic with a vision, but aren't really good at the strategic building blocks to get there. Whereas these high-level military officers were really good at figuring out what is the strategy. And so we talked about things like up-leveling the function of the Department of Defense to what if up-leveling the function of Department of Defense to a higher mission. So it's not just to defend something, is actually to proactively create peace. So there's so many different threads that we could explore on all this, but it's been something that we're really proud of our peace programs have, I just looked up the stat, have reached 110,000 people in 141 countries. And that's a kind of an interesting high level statistic, but where it gets really exciting and fun is thinking about the specific stories. There was one person who runs a refugee camp in Nigeria for women who got really turned on to our peace building work. And so we'd play all these peace building sessions over loudspeakers to women in a refugee camp.
Wow.
And really inspiring them with the voices of different people. Or there was one person I talked to who was fresh out of college and was driving home across the entire United States. And they said they listened to our entire Summer of Peace library for that journey, like 3,000 miles across the country. And when they got to the other side of the country, they decided to commit their lives to peace building. And
wow.
So, we've done stuff, partnered with things in Israel and around the world. And even Barbara Marx Hubbbard, who is kind of at the root of a lot of this work too, and kind of a kindred sister to Avon Mattison, her impulse to have a marker point for 2012, which was sort of a prophetic year in certain ways from traditional perspectives, and to focus on having a birthing of a new culture and a new consciousness around the world with many events around the world. It was also a peace building effort in many ways. And so all this effort culminated in what we're now calling the Phillip Hellmich World Peace Library, which is the free and most extensive online resources that we're aware of. Has over 375 different interviews that are free with leading peace builders around the world and practices, 26 different sectors of society. We've done a Global Peace Builders broadcast with Philip and Sister Jenna did. I should mention that Philip has passed from this plane, but all the reports are is that he's very actively engaged in supporting this work on the other side and very joyful about it, as he always was through most of his life. And so there are just a lot of really cool things that have developed from this, and including the partnership with you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's an incredible legacy. It really is. And, so many of those things that you referenced and mentioned, came across my inbox at some point as somebody who was, interested and following along and fascinating. I remember the Summer of Peace. I thought, what an amazing initiative to really dedicate and devote 3 months during the Northern Summer to highlight and to connect and to really advance the work. And I love that quote from Phillip Hellmich of, from inner to international. And you at Shift Network have really, been right across that spectrum and, led by Philip's efforts and supported, of course, by your leadership, Stephen. Those initiatives have had an incredible impact. The Summer of Peace, the Peace Ambassador program that you talk about, which has touched so many lives and inspired so many people. And, sometimes we're asked to measure our, impact. And, sometimes I think the most powerful projects are beyond our ability to measure, because when you touch people at a deep level, you never know what, as you say, what those seeds are going to go on and become. And that's why it's a great joy to be here today in Peace Week 2022. As you know, but I think it's worth pointing out again, the 2012 birth events that you did with Barbara Marx Hubbbard. You and Barbara Marx Hubbbard did the sort of global event back before we had sort of Zoom, or like a long time before. You did it sort of with pretty rudimentary technology, but connecting events all around the world that were orientating around that particular date, 22 December 2012, where so many groups had got the call to show up. Obviously the Mayan calendar was the inspiration for that, but there was something kind of cosmic happening. And even today, when we meet organizations and groups in this work, Stephen, it's incredible how many of them got their initiation or literally got started on that period of time. There's 2 or 3 days. We were in Chiang Mai, Thailand, doing our very first interspiritual festival called U-Day Festival, and it was small. There was 50 Thai Buddhist monks. We had Pato Banton and Antoinette come out. We had our Sufi friends from Turkey come, and some indigenous content. It was beautiful. It was music and spirituality. But we were really honored to be a part of Birth 2012. And and since then it's grown. The work of Unity Earth and Partners and the global network has grown a lot since then. But it was definitely a birthing moment, and it was a really important thing for us to be a part of what you had created. And so I think then, we're working now in this trans-organizational way, and I think we're getting better at it, Stephen, too, of being able to, like the flock of, flock of gulls, flock of birds, swans, whatever it is, that we all have different roles to play at different times. And, we've referenced here Barbara Marx Hubbbard, and what an incredible champion for peace, referenced Avon Mattison, referenced James O'Day, of course, is still with us, and Phillip Hellmich. And there are so many other incredible peace builders on the planet. And I think that part of the work is connecting them and letting us see just how vast this movement can become. So as we come into 2022, let me ask you, Stephen, as somebody who's dedicated decades of time and thinking and resources and vision to this work globally, where do you think, how do you think we're going? The peace movement, the culture of peace on the planet, the kind of growing spiritual culture on the planet, the work that's been done, the advances that have been made, the challenges that we face in every forum. How would you say we're traveling right now?
I think that it's sort of like there's like these dual tracks. One track on the surface, if you just watch the evening news cycles, it can be a little bit depressing and feel like we're not making much progress at all, and we're often regressing, and particularly in some of the rise of more authoritarian movements away from democracy. And, rise of Putin invading Ukraine. But I think that the deeper trend lines are actually really beautiful and good, is that we have been on a steady downslope away from violence as a species. There have been some upticks, there's been some flare-ups of this, and it can be exacerbated by, news and social media. There's like certain negative eddies that can get created because people in a fear state are more easy to motivate and to mobilize. And so politically that can be, when people are in a fear state, it can be weaponized. And so that's part of where authoritarianism rises up, because it's actually a method of consolidating power and channeling power in certain directions, usually in a, less evolutionary and harmful direction. But I think what we're getting is we're gradually increasing our sense of resistance, or just a feeling that it is no longer acceptable for humanity to be at war with itself. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he was operating from a 19th century playbook in which this was largely accepted, that the, quote, great powers would simply invade their neighbors and take them over and dominate them economically and exploit them, and that was considered part of the playbook for how nations were run. And historically, we had a lot of centuries and millennia in which the sort of conquering of adjacent nation states or tribes, or it was just rule of the mighty and the military might, rather than what is truly right. And so I think what was heartening about that is the rising up of a sentiment around the world that this was like no longer okay, that it was morally reprehensible to invade and try to subjugate another country. And so I think that's a marker point, that we are starting to turn historically, that we are getting to the point where humanity as a whole is saying enough. And the next level down from that is that we're getting more sophisticated about understanding our methodologies. We're getting more sophisticated about understanding how to transform trauma, because traumatized people are often the ones who can be either act out in violence or be mobilized for violent purposes as well. And so rooting out the depths of trauma, healing some of our historical wounds, our ancestral inheritance, understanding the root systems of why we are kind of get identified into fearful tribes that polarize against each other. There's a lot more sophistication around the psychology of change, and spiritual practices getting more sophisticated. There's more advanced teachings like Thomas Hubble around working with collective fields of karma and helping to digest those. He's done that with Jews and Germans, helping to digest the unprocessed energy of the Holocaust. And so there's I think a flowering of methods, a deeper recognition by more and more people that peace really should be our birthright as planetary citizens, and a sense of justified outrage when people cross a line. Now I say all this, and the United States in many ways is sort of becoming the problem child of the global system, or one of them, where we have an exaggerated outworking of political polarization and violence and gun violence in our society. And for me, I think that connects to, there's some founding DNA in how the United States was created as a violent rebellion from England that led to a certain glorification of hypermasculine violence as a sort of ideal. And I don't think that's actually the truth of America's contribution ultimately on the global stage. I think we're here to be a peace-building nation, and we haven't always done a good job of it. So some of being peace builders is cultivating practices. Some of it is speaking truth about what's going on in the world and offering pathways to transform it. And so for me, one of the areas for peace building that's most alive for me is really the healing of our democracy in America, because I think until we sort of do a deeper healing of our polarized democracy and to really outwork that pattern, it's hard for the United States to have integrity as a peace-building force in the world, because there's so much violence within our system right now. And so I think that, I have a deeper trust in the deeper trend lines, that we are moving beyond warring nation states that can just clobber each other and create all sorts of havoc and destruction. And I think we're seeing that in Ukraine, is like this is a no more kind of moment, that the global community is saying we cannot have this as part of our operating system. We are seeing a great upsurge of really skilled interventions to help heal our legacy of trauma and legacy of violence. And it's still a process. In some places, there's hot spots that are outworking more of the, the tendency towards violence. And I think that we're, it's not going to, I don't think we're going to snap our fingers and have it overnight, but I would say the trend lines for me look like by 2030, I feel very optimistic that we're going to be moving out of this pattern collectively, and that by 2050, where I think we're going to be living in a much more sustainable way, renewable energy, all those trend lines are really good so that we stop feeling obliged to invade other countries or manipulate other countries in order to gain access to their resources. Countries will be more self-sufficient, powered by renewable sources. I think that we will have turned the tide on some of the resource scarcity based on really addressing some of the systemic shifts. Now, we're going to be going through a time of increased crises, both ecological crises, water scarcity, resource scarcity. So there are going to be stressors, and there may be significant flare-ups of violence that happen on a kind of systemic level. But I think that's why it's so important that all of us who really recognize that peace is the truth of who we are, and that's how we outpicture our own spiritual recognitions and development, that are really here to kind of anchor in the wisdom and the peace building that can help us stabilize through some of these stressors that we're going to be facing as a species, and really get to the other side where I believe by 2050, war will have been abolished on this planet, and that we will really be very sophisticated about training people in peace-building practices from a young age, and really embedding that in the DNA of each culture, so that we're really making violence an unacceptable part of the human condition, and that it's really something that is dealt with when it happens, but that it's not just tolerated as a fact of human existence.
Well, that's a very beautiful and optimistic vision of the next few decades, Stephen. I want to do a couple of things. I want to give you a little bit of advance warning to start thinking about this as well. So, Phillip, we want to be honoring Phillip. I love the idea of the library. For those who maybe didn't know Phillip as well as you do, before we close today, I'd love to hear a personal story or something that you remember about Phillip. And I often hear about his quirky sense of humor, as well as, obviously his incredible devotion to the work. But it'd be lovely just to hear a personal story before we finish. But I wanted to give you a few moments to think about that. But just before we get there, I loved what you said about meeting the military guys and the perspective on strategy. A lot of people really talk about the Martin Luther King quote. It comes back time and time and time again, the one about learning to organize as effectively. Those who love peace should, need to learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. So there's an organizing effectively component, which is deeply related in some concepts to strategy as well. But I'd love to get your insights on, what do you think we can learn as the grassroots global peace building community, if you like? I mean, we're not quite yet a movement. We want to become a movement, but it's really more of a community. And I think you put those two camps really well. You've got the diplomats working at that high, international intellectual level where change is very slow and very incremental, and they may or may not be spiritually kind of motivated. And then you've got the global grassroots, which is full of good heart, loves the arts, and full of this idealism. But what can we learn to get better, to organize more effectively, and to be more effective in our strategies, maybe say from a military structure or from a business structure or from other parts of human endeavor where it's results driven?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one thing is to collaborate around high leverage outcomes in a particular area. So, which may not even necessarily involve a huge number of people, but it could be that it's like there's just something that's like an acupressure point that needs to be addressed. And for some reason, what's coming to me is that when there was an escalation of tension with Iran around the nuclear development, basically, that was sort of an escalation. It looked like things were trending towards potential wartime setting. We actually, Phillip and I, decided to create a delegation to go to Iran. And this was done in the guise of tourism, but it was also about a little bit of a peace building mission. And so there were people from the peace building programs who went, and also other people who just wanted to get to know Iran a little bit, because it was being very demonized in a lot of ways in the Western media. And what they found was the most charitable, generous people that they'd ever experienced. And so it's like there's high level polarization between governments. And so Phillip just shared a lot when he came back, and shared a lot of different things about the Iranian people, and sort of, and you never know who that touches and what these kind of subtle effects are. So that was just an example of like, okay, here's something that's escalating in the world. Can we be a little drop of positive benefit? We didn't end up escalating into war with Iran. Things did de-escalate, and you never know where those little tipping point, butterfly wing sort of strategies intervene. It can be at a grassroots level. It's like in a high school that you really want to build a peace building program in the high school, and let's bring in Challenge Day and let's bring in other folks, or thinking about what sort of area could you have the most effect in. If you're really concerned about political violence, it's like, how about, building a bridge? There's a guy who was super inspiring about the KKK. He was a black man, a musician, who made a point to befriend members of the KKK and personally turn the belief systems around for, I think, a few dozen of them, but maybe more in his lifetime. And that was his very personal way. So I think there's some things that we can do on a very personal level, thinking about where could we have a strategic impact, and to be focused on that for a while and to really give it traction, or working collaboratively on something that's a little bit more systemic that might go beyond us. And so Avon Mattison is a great example of somebody who worked on something very systemic. She really dedicated her life to it. She's not well known in the general public, but most people have heard, I think, of the International Day of Peace at this point, and it would not exist without her. And so she thought that would be a beautiful unifying day for humanity to be able to join together. And so others like us have been inspired by that and expanded upon that, created, global peace dances around that, or global events. And there's all these different wings, and it's very organic. And it's like, but it took her kind of committing to birthing this particular thing. That was a very long-term strategic commitment. Yeah. And so I think that if we think about, let's say that, we were in the military, and we decided, it's like, I'm not into the military stuff, but that might give you a really interesting entry point into working with, former veterans who have been, accused of domestic violence, as an example. So there's sort of a legacy of war, a legacy of kind of martial psychology and violent psychology that gets outpictured in the legacy with veterans. And so maybe you can make a real big impact in that area. Scarlett Lewis just has become a cultural figure, and we were exploring doing some partnership with her because she really took it on as the mother of one of the Sandy Hook kids who was killed, and one of the kids who actually protected other children. She took it on as part of her legacy and his legacy to sort of be a champion publicly for the kind of peace building in schools and healing work in schools. So I think that, what happens is, if whatever we commit to tends to inspire and touch others. So finding something that has personal relevance, it's like, where have we been touched by violence in a personal way, and making a commitment to doing something in that arena for a while. And then also collaborating with other people, because it's like respecting that there's all these different facets of how do we create peace on the planet. And we do need thousands and millions of different interconnected efforts. But then part of it is weaving those efforts together, seeing how they're complementary to each other and synergistic rather than competitive. And ultimately, that's how I think we do it. And then some at the high level, for people who have more networks and visibility, it's like working on things that could really move the needle systemically. I'll give an example of something that sounds really out of the box, but where my mind's been going lately is that I see that the Republican Party is basically, in the United States, has descended into a kind of really a sort of a zone of violence and combativeness that is dangerous for our body politic, and that there's a dysfunctionality. And so basically there needs to be a 2.0 version of the Republican Party that actually gets back to its spiritual roots. And so even though I'm a Democrat and have largely been involved on the progressive side, like I've been thinking a lot more seriously about like, what if I devoted a few years to being in service to the reinvention of the Republican Party in a new way? So this way it's come through is the Party of Lincoln, which is sort of resurrecting the higher ideals of why Lincoln led to the creation of the Republican Party, and getting back to those roots, which is ultimately a healing and culturally unifying kind of perspective rather than the polarizing perspective that's really largely taken over, which is also romanticizing violence in a lot of different ways and manifested in January 6th insurrection. So that's a sort of out of the box way of thinking about things. It's like maybe the best way of me being a influence on the healing of our democracy is actually dedicating myself to the up-leveling of the Republican Party with people that I respect on the other side, and to sort of this kind of next evolutionary turn of the spiral of what the conservative wing of politics looks like. So that may not be resonate with a lot of other people, but it might be that like, so I just encouraging people to think a little out of the box. And then for me, it's like, oh, if I do commit to that work, then I have a lot of allies I can pull into it in different ways. So it's like building in spiritual principles and nonviolent communication practices and other things that might be really helpful to have a conservative political party that is clearly consecrated to a nonviolent way of evolving our democracy too.
Yeah, well, that's great, and certainly would be a valuable contribution, Stephen. I love that. It reminds me of a line, the world is more malleable than we think. And I think it might have been Bono who said that. But I love that what you're sharing is really pick your issue that you're passionate about, commit to it, get creative, think outside of the box, and then resource and partner up to engage it for the long haul and get it done. And I think that's that's an exciting call to action for everybody. Thanks for sharing that.
The get it done is kind of interesting because it's sort of like, did Avon Mattison get it done in her lifetime? Peace movement is such a broad, deep thing. Like if the ultimate goal is world peace, which is what we're all really moving towards, where peace is the operating system for our planet, probably none of us are going to get it done in our lifetimes, but we can help to keep the momentum in that direction. And so that it's like each little action, each new initiative, each thing that we share, each thing that gets spread, it's like we're just getting a little bit closer, a little further down the field. So it actually gives us a kind of interesting opportunity to work on something that doesn't have as much necessarily immediate gratification as we're used to. As like we don't necessarily just get world peace done in a year or a decade or maybe even a century, but it is like, oh, we're contributing to this trend line that is an expression of our deepest truth and our highest aspirations as a human species, and to be happy with just making progress every year. There's some progress, touching a few people. If you're trying to convert some KKK members, it's like you make a few wins. You sort of get one person to talk off the ledge of committing violence in the society. You help one veteran turn things around after the wounds they got in Afghanistan and they were otherwise going to commit suicide. And, I think those are sometimes the stories that move us the most. I was speaking of the violence, there was somebody that I heard about secondarily, but who was born in the South, more evangelical, served in Afghanistan, and was really sort of hit a point of such serious disillusionment that they literally were going to kill themselves. And basically got a ping on the phone about a Shift Network program, and ended up deciding not to kill themselves. I don't know if it was like quite in the minute or whatever, and they decided to sort of give something a try with, turned out to be like Peruvian shamanism. And so it's sort of like they ended up being in this Peruvian shamanism program, which had nothing to do with the belief system they grew up in, but it offered a pathway of meaning and purpose. And that person ended up not committing suicide and kind of blossoming into a new life. And who knows where that one person, one life is going to go, or somebody that was in a refugee camp who had a little dose of hope. So I don't think we should ever underestimate the power of touching one person, because that one person might be it's like Avon Mattison having a conversation with me sparked me, and same thing with you. And it's like, and you're touching tons of lives, and we've touched. So it's like these like, breaking this sort of the big world peace vision down to kind of the specific one person at a time. And to trust that it's like we're making progress, we're making our contribution, and we may not get to the promised land even in our lifetime, but it's sure worth trying.
Yeah, we will get there. We will get there eventually. That's right. And, planting seeds and watering seeds that we may not see grow. And Avon was an incredible example of that, Stephen. So just as we finish today, this has been fantastic to sit down with you and like talk about some of the, the champions and the wonderful, inspiring heroes of the peace building movement over the last few decades, and in particular the contribution and Shift network, over the last couple of decades. Have you got a Phillip Hellmich story that you recall that kind of gives us a bit of insight into who he is?
Well, the thing that was struck in his memorial that struck me is like how he touched almost everybody on our team with little acts of kindness. And, so it would just be like, oh, when I moved to California and started the Shift Network, Phillip gave me a ring and said, do you need any help like unpacking boxes or helping people move or take them out for a meal or whatever? It's like, he was the king of random acts of kindness. And his peace building wasn't just grand on like the planetary level. Is it like, he really loved people and he wanted them to feel better and be happier. And so he just did like so many thousands of acts of little kindnesses to people. And it was interesting just how much those things touch people. It was like, on his memorial call that we did internally, is that like, there were so many things that I had never heard about that he had just done quietly behind the scenes. And as a result of that, it's like he really helped to create a more cohesive, loving, connected culture just by his little good deeds. And the other thing that always struck me was that he also really liked to, he had this really kind of almost adolescent boy giggly side there. He liked to play like little practical jokes. And when I was on another memorial, I was hearing about how he did it like when he was in West Africa in the Peace Corps. He did this elaborate practical joke where his boss in the Peace Corps basically went out to buy peanuts, and like he had printed all this paper that had like this joke of like this person being a naughty boy or something like that. And so he like literally gets peanuts from a random street vendor, and it's got like a message to him, and he was just like so delighted by that. And so I think that what Phillip also really brought is like sort of the random acts of kindness, like never overlook those, because it's like there were so many thousands of people that he touched with random acts of kindness, and those people each remember that, and that's really key. And that's a good message for me, because I can sometimes focus on the big picture systemic stuff and not as much on the personal. And for me, he was a great teacher for that. And I think that making it like bringing in the silliness. He was a great, like he and Emily Hine were these great punsters, and so they would just almost have like pun offs back and forth, and you'd groan and be like, oh, it's terrible, some of those puns, but it was funny. And just the delight he had about making puns around things and kind of swatting things back and forth. Yeah. It's also a good example of just how important just humor is to peace building. Is it sometimes it's like where we get stuck is where we're kind of very serious, and a playful light heart, like a little bit of joke, a little bit of silly laughter, a little bit of goofiness can often discharge the attention and open to a more connective experience. And so those were two of the things that kind of really stood out for me as like this playful, silly side, and just like random acts of kindness that really touched people. And that's part of why he was able to bring so many peace builders together and create really the largest peace building library resource on the web, and really, touch 110,000 people in other countries, and partially because he just met and befriended and made people laugh, and made people feel like they were important. And out of that, he birthed so many beautiful things. And I think that's part of what I took away from the memorial of his life, is to really see the importance of those things.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for sharing that and kind of, bringing us into Philip's personality and his joy of life and way of being. It's a really beautiful thing to have here in the field to celebrate his life and his contribution. And of course, it's all ongoing. 2022 is, we're looking forward to next year as well. And I hope, Stephen, in 2023, we can connect and collaborate around, these 99 days of peace through unity, which in some senses are a continuation of the field of the Summer of Peace from Shift Network, and obviously Peace Week in September, and all the good things. The field rolls on. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing these important reflections about your viewpoint over the last couple of decades on the work that you've been instrumental in, and the team around you, and particularly Philip and Avon and Barbara. And it's really inspiring. And on we go. We just keep going and pushing that hill along, pushing the wheel along, and we'll get as far
onwards. Well, thank you, Ben, for all your dedication and really weaving people together too. I think that you've really taken up that mantle in such a great way of just honoring all the many dimensions and people that are required to make peace a reality on this planet. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.